Hello, everyone. Welcome to the new episode of Web Workers Online. I got us going a little bit early because I see we've got a couple raids happening. So, quick shout out to one Kevin Griff and to Corey over at the CLW channel. I appreciate all of y'all coming in, hanging out. We're going to be talking with the amazing George Spake here in a few minutes, talking about React Query, talking about Tailwind CSS. So, I hope you'll hang out and kind of, you know, chill and learn a little bit tonight. We're going to be talking about complex UIs solved very simply with those two technologies. It's my first time in a new setup, so we'll see how that goes. If you're hearing any sort of audio issues, let me know. I'll try to fix it as we kind of go through. So again, Raiders, I appreciate you coming, hanging out. We're going to have a good time tonight listening to George. I'm going to go ahead and bring George on screen, and we're going to say hello and get things moving. Hey, George, how's it going tonight? How are you doing?
I'm great.
I'm
How are
doing
you?
well. So, for those of you who don't know anything about Web Workers, it is originally a Memphis-based local meetup, but obviously with things like COVID-19, we can't get together in person anymore. But as it turns out, I also don't live in Memphis anymore. As of about a week and a half ago, I'm up in Michigan. So my friends in Memphis still get to hang out with me, come talk at Web Workers, and teach us some stuff. So George is one of those aforementioned friends. Give us a little intro about yourself real fast, George.
Well, I went ahead and turned my background off since I saw you have a little Zelda shrine. So
Yep.
I have my own Zelda shrine. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. 8 or 9 years of experience as a programmer, web developer. I've been actively involved with the Memphis tech scene for about that long. Um, Web workers, just to name one. And yeah, I just have learned a lot through these sorts of things. And anytime I come across something cool that I think other people would be interested in, I've learned to give a talk about it.
Nice.
So that's what I'm doing tonight. And if anyone listening has anything that they want to talk about that doesn't fall into the web, UI, design, JavaScript category, there's also a user group called Dev Memphis, which I sort of help organize and is the culmination of several other user specific, but I like to say it's sort of the web workers for everything that doesn't fit into web workers. So if you have a
Yeah.
programming related topic, um, or something technical that is cool that you think you'd like to share, um, find me on Slack. Look up Dev Memphis on meetup.com. There's also devmemphis.org. So easy to find and glad to accept talks if you have anything that you're interested in talking about.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
that's all. It's all about all I have in terms of announcements
Cool.
and
Awesome.
intro.
And one note, I saw somebody mention in chat that my audio is only coming through one channel. That's my bad. I can't fix it without stopping the stream. So luckily, you're not going to listen to me too much tonight. You're going to mostly be listening to George, and we'll kind of deal with that as we go. So George, I'm going to go ahead and switch us over to your presentation mode. And if anyone has any questions, be sure to post in chat. I'll either interrupt George or we'll handle them at the end and kind of go from there. Let's see. And you.
Okay, so just to give an idea of what to expect here, I'm going to talk about Tailwind, then I'm going to talk about React Query, and then I'm going to do a little demo. And Tailwind and React Query are not really related to each other. I just happened to sort of come across them at the same time, and they're both pretty cool. So uh, I want to talk about both of them. But I'll just dive right in. So starting with Tailwind, the easiest thing to compare Tailwind to, which most people are probably already familiar with, is Bootstrap. Bootstrap is um, a huge part of UI development since it's been around. As mobile devices got popular, Bootstrap became an invaluable tool for developing responsive UIs, and it gave the web community a single sort of open source repository to implement responsive design collectively. So it helped a lot as everybody was figuring all that stuff out. And it also contributed a lot to how we think about maintaining front-end style code bases. CSS can get messy, and Bootstrap introduced some structure to that. And so while Bootstrap is typically associated with look and feel, it also contributed a lot in terms of how we organize our UI code bases. Bootstrap works by giving you a bunch of classes that represent components. So for instance, on the screen, if you give an HTML element the btn class, short for button, it will give you a little button component complete with rounded corners, background color, hover styles, and everything you need right out of the box. So this is sort of a simple culmination of a bunch of CSS styles represented by a class. And at some point, Bootstrap introduced this cool notion of utility classes where you could use a naming convention to represent a lot of common things we do in CSS, like adding margins and spacing and widths. So what that would look like is if you wanted to add a left margin to a button, you wouldn't have to go write some custom styles or add inline styles. You could just add ML for margin left -2, and W-100 represents width 100%. So these are sort of intuitive associations we already have with CSS. We know exactly what we want to do and how to do it in CSS. And now we can just represent that in this nice little class name syntax. And that's on top of all the components that Bootstrap gives us already, like buttons. And I use these every day. I work with Bootstrap a lot. I've really liked the addition of utility classes. They're really helpful. So Bootstrap is great. I know I've debated with Rob many times over the years about all Bootstrap sites looking the same, which is a valid thing you'll hear from a lot of designers, is because Bootstrap comes to the table with a lot of opinions. It makes things really easy, and you can make a site look really nice. But you're going to have to do some work if you want to sort of hide the fact that you're using Bootstrap. Also, because Bootstrap has a lot of JavaScript required for some of its components, like tooltips and accordions, things that you have to have JavaScript for, it has opinions. And if you want to use Bootstrap with React or Angular, you're going to need a third-party implementation of those JavaScript parts along with Bootstrap, which can be a little tricky, and you're a little bit at the whims of those third-party projects rather than the main Bootstrap project. Finally, Bootstrap is kind of complex when you get under the hood. So if you want to customize it or theme it, you want to learn how to do it the right way, which can take a little bit of a learning curve. And B, if you don't do it the right way, it can turn into a huge mess. If you do it the right way and you're committed to managing a customized Bootstrap sort of code base, then it can be great, and it's great to work with. But it can be a little tricky to customize. So what's Tailwind? Tailwind takes the idea of utility classes and just applies them to all of CSS. So instead of just spacing, now you can do just about anything you can do in CSS, anything you can think of, and represent it with class names. And this sort of breaks away from the way we're accustomed to thinking about CSS, where the class names have meaning for how something looks. Instead, this is more of I like to think of it as an API for CSS implemented in HTML classes. Really new, kind of obvious concept, kind of surprising it took so long to really catch on or somebody to come up with it in this way. But Bootstrap kind of set the stage with the utility classes. Tailwind took those utility classes and added on to that idea by just extending it to everything in CSS. So there's no more button class. You would just combine a bunch of classes that represent CSS styles to make that button. And here's what that looks like. So at the top, you see they've created a Bootstrap button with, by stringing together a bunch of styles. BG blue 500 makes the background blue. 500 represents the amount of blue, or the hue of blue, I guess. And hover BG blue just makes that a little bit darker. Text white is going to make the font style white. Font bold is going to make it bold. PY is actually padding on the y-axis. So that's going to add top and bottom padding of 2. And you can see the calculation for 2 and 4 and how you can customize that in the settings. But that's just a general spacing. And PX, as you can guess, is the x-axis. So left and right are going to have a padding of 4, and then it's cut off a little bit on the end, but the last one is rounded, which gives it those rounded corners. Then below that, you can see how you can use apply to just string those classes together into your own classes. So if you do want to re-implement Bootstrap, you can actually use these Tailwind classes to reconstruct those easy to use Bootstrap classes, but they're still comprised of the classes provided by Tailwind. So that's sort of an intro to the general concept. First thing you're going to run into when you start using this is you're going to have a ton of classes in your markup, and this throws you off at first, inevitably, just like anything that's kind of shocking. It kind of reminds me of JSX. I think it took a really long time to get over having HTML looking markup or syntax in JavaScript. And then on top of that, it's convention in JSX. If you're using React, you'll often see each attribute on a new line, which is really weird when it first came along, but now I've gotten used to it. And it seems normal. I think you'll experience the same thing with Tailwind. It's just kind of a mind shift to get used to seeing a lot of classes. But the great thing about it is it's really transparent. It's really easy to see where a style is coming from because you know it's going to have a class. So you get used to it, and after a while, your development pattern kind of shifts a little more towards classes, and it starts to make a whole lot of sense, and I've started to really like it. Because Tailwind covers all of CSS, the development file size is huge. While you're working, Tailwind is going to generate a CSS file called Tailwind generated, I think, and it's about 90,000 lines of CSS. And it's about 2 megabytes. You can see there. However, because of the way Tailwind works, it actually comes with a purge feature, which uses a regex to look through all of your files, find all the classes, and it's actually just a really simple, sort of primitive mechanism to go through, find all the classes you're using, and strip everything else out of the file so that the CSS file that you send to the browser only has the stuff that you need in it. And this is not a new concept. Everybody's heard of tree shaking, but it's nice to have this built in where you don't have to wire up a bunch of stuff to make this work. One thing you do need to keep in mind, and it says this in the docs, is you need to write purgable HTML. And that means instead of using templating to write out your classes, you need to be explicit about your classes, because in this case, that regex is not going to recognize that text-error is a class name. You actually need to include that in your logic, the entire class name, so that the regex can go through and find it. If you're using React, and I'm sure there's a similar library for other JavaScript libraries, the class names library is really nice because it makes conditional class names really easy to work with. So because Tailwind is class name oriented, that React class names library helps a whole lot. And I don't know if I feel like it'd be kind of painful to use Tailwind without it. You'd have a lot of unnecessary markup that would just get cleaned up a lot by that library. And I will pull that up as part of the demo too, just to show it. Development, this is something new I learned about. So the first few days of working with Tailwind, I had never used, in all my years, have never used this little class tab in DevTools. And this is in Firefox and Chrome, but it's really useful. You can come in and add new classes, check, uncheck classes to activate them or turn them off. And this is just how you work with Tailwind. You kind of move from that traditional flow of working in the CSS elements area and changing CSS styles directly to just adding and removing classes using this CLS tab. You're also going to be referencing the docs a lot, at least initially, because like I said, most of the time, if you know CSS, you know what you want to do. Sometimes you just have to go search the docs for what that actual class name is. And it's a lot of times you don't even have to look it up. It's just intuitive. When you start out as you're learning, just its sort of conventions and the way Tailwind classes work, you will reference this a lot, and it's also nice to look at all the color variations and stuff, but it's kind of cool while you're in the docs, you'll notice that there are just CSS rules for everything. Tailwind CSS, you can learn everything you need to know there. The docs are great. It's really intuitive. You can just sort of fall right into how it works. Lately, I'm a big fan of this question, anytime you're using something new, asking what the abstraction is. And Tailwind is a low-level abstraction overriding plain CSS. So it's fast, easy, and intuitive, especially if you've used Bootstrap, and really especially if you've used Bootstrap utility classes, which if you're using Bootstrap, you probably have. It's a little bit more flexible than Bootstrap. It doesn't come with opinions about what a button should look like and that sort of thing. It comes with that built-in purge, so that's kind of out of the box best practice. You're going to be sending a small CSS file on. It does kind of discourage direct interaction with CSS. And actually in the demo, I'll show you, I haven't written any CSS, and it's kind of cool to be able to build a UI that looks clean and modern, like it might have been built with Bootstrap or something, but no custom CSS and no Bootstrap. It's just HTML classes that represent CSS, not the full components. So that's kind of the abstraction there. And that's saving some stuff for the demo, but that's kind of the initial intro to Tailwind. Do we have any questions yet before I jump into React Query?
Yeah, George, I got one question from Ryan. He said, this was multiple slides ago. Do you need a pre or post processor for that @apply rule?
That's actually a good question. So you're referring to this. I'm not sure if that is actually, and I actually meant to look that up before I gave the talk because I haven't used that before. But I don't know if that is Tailwind or something else, but we'll find out in a minute because once I get to the demo, I'll pull up the Tailwind app docs, and that I think is on the first page. So that should tell us where that's coming from. But that's actually a good question. I don't know.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah. But regardless of where it's coming from, I think it's cool that you can kind of look at that and see what's happening there. It's kind of a cool concept. Any other questions before React Query?
Not as of right now. It looks like everyone's waiting on that React Query part 2.
Okay, so React Query is another state management thing. It's in that family of Redux and MobX and all those fun state management tools we all have to use now. So first of all, why is client-side state management so important? This has definitely become one of the bigger topics in web development, UI development, front-end development, whatever you want to call it recently. Maybe you're using React, maybe you're using Angular, maybe you're using Vue. If you're writing single page app stuff, most likely you're going to have some sort of local state you're managing, and that gets complex, and we need these tools to manage state. But why is it all so important all of a sudden? Well, traditionally, and I just found these diagrams on the internet, they're not exactly what I would have drawn, but they get the point across. So traditionally, and still to a large extent, data, your state lives on the back end. There's a server serving up data from a database, and before it sends it to the web browser, it builds it all into some static assets and just sends it over the wire. You can think of all this stuff as ephemeral. The real state in the application lies in that red box. If everything else goes away, you can fire it all back up and the state is still there. All those user sessions and whatever's in the database and that sort of thing, that's your real state, your source of truth. As single page apps have become more prevalent and we've sort of gotten more into this client server model on the web, we've added additional state to the front end. So now we're sending these JavaScript applications to the browser, and instead of requesting those static assets over and over again, they're requesting data and updating the UI in the browser with that data that we're storing on the client. So now we have our backend state, our source of truth, still have that data in the database, but now we have all this data we're keeping track of on the front end. And that gets tricky. And that's where all these state management libraries come from. So most of them follow sort of the same pattern. They have some sort of a concept of a store where you keep your data, some pattern for changing the state in the store and mutating those values and updating components when state changes. So if you look at the diagrams for these, they all look fairly similar. There's always a store or a state, and there's actions to change that state, and changes to the state result in the UI being updated. So they all pretty much work the same way. But the general concept is we're keeping up with a bunch of state, a bunch of data in the client in JavaScript on the front end. Well, React Query kind of suggests this obvious notion that a lot of what we're doing with front-end state management is just managing an HTTP cache almost of what's really our state, which is that back-end source of truth, our database. That's where all of the real state lives, and we're sending a bunch of state to the browser. And what we've been doing with Redux and MobX is managing that state manually, managing what's really ultimately a cache of that server-side data in our browser. And it can get really messy, even though, especially with a lot of CRUD apps, it's the same sort of thing across the board. We're fetching data, we're getting a response back in JSON, we're taking that JSON, we're loading it into our local state, and then we're representing that state in our user interface. Well, a lot of that data is just the data from the back end. And we treat that data like it's important local state, when really what it is a cache. So React Query describes itself as performant and powerful data synchronization for React. Fetch, cache, and update data in your React and React Native apps without touching any global state in quotes. I think the key word here is synchronization. That's really the key. Like, so much of what we do when we talk about state management is just synchronizing what you see in the UI with what we have persisted on the back end. And I think he describes it really well here. Writing your data fetching logic by hand is on its way out. You can just tell React Query where to get your data, how fresh you want to keep it, and the rest is automatic. So it handles caching, background updates, and stale data out of the box with zero configuration. And the important part here, I think, is where to get your data. Okay, that's obvious, but you tell React Query how fresh you want to keep your data, and React Query will handle fetching that data as needed. And if it's time for React Query to fetch some new data, you can just make the data in the cache stale, and React Query will handle that for you. It'll also do things like refetching when you focus on the window. So if you click off a tab and go do something else for an hour and come back, you want that data to be fetched again to make sure it's up to date so you don't have users looking at stale data. So that's all kind of out of the box. Real quick glance at what React Query is. It's really just 3 imports. So there's 2 hooks, use query and use mutation, and the cache. And down here, and we're also importing our fetch methods. So get to dos and post to dos. This might be like an Axios or a fetch method that just has the HTTP request and returns a thenable response. So it's Axios will return a promise. That's kind of what it expects. So down here, we're using use query, we're passing in a query key to dos. And this is really sort of a really important concept in React Query as well, because the query key is what identifies some data in your cache. In this case, our to-dos, we're going to use get to-dos to fetch those. To-dos is going to be the query ID. We're going to pass those to use query. And now we can call to-dos query and get our, and it will load our to-dos into the cache, which we can then read from. And then here we're passing our post to do fetch method to use mutation along with what we want to happen on success. So again, we can invalidate the to-dos in our cache based on that query key, and that will trigger a refetch, I think. I need the rest of this example here, but this is actually the example from the first page of their docs. If you want to learn more about this, go watch this video. This is the author of React Query, and he kind of walks through all the logic behind it and how it works really concisely, better than I can. And he also wrote another library called React Table, which you should also check out. Also, just a bunch of hooks for dealing with tables in React. So if you haven't figured it out yet, hooks are the future. So if you're not up on React hooks, take some time, read up on those. React Query is a great way to learn hooks. React Router and a lot of the other popular libraries now are exposing their API via hooks. So that's a great thing to learn. Also, as I was working on this, I talked to somebody who said they were using SWR, which seems to be pretty much the exact same thing, and I will definitely be checking this out. I like that SWR is kind of direct in its description of itself as a HTTP cache type of library, and it actually uses this RFC as its concept, its main concept, but it does a lot of the same stuff. It's just a matter of keeping a cache of your HTTP request and revalidating them and refetching as needed based on how aggressively you want to update your UI based on changes on the back end. One thing I'll mention about this is when you first start working with React Query, it can be chatty. I actually have that in the cost here. So getting out of myself. The abstraction here, it's React Query is sort of a high-level abstraction over local state management patterns that are concerned with HTTP caching. So a lot of the stuff we do in state management, and I think if you don't take anything else away from this, think about all the requests you make in your single page apps and think about what you do with the responses from those requests. And if you keep them around, how much do you care about them and how much do you trust that that data is new? And start to think about whether your local state management is really important or if a lot of it is just caching your HTTP responses. And regardless of what you use or the pattern you follow for state management, if you have that concept in mind and you can recognize when you're caching and not really managing important state, it can help you think about some of this stuff better. I know personally, I've worked on a lot of applications with really complex state management, and in retrospect, if I just understood this concept, it might have made things a lot less complex. So benefits, it's once you learn it, it's a simple API. You get consistent data fetching and caching across your app. And you might be able to alleviate the need for a dedicated state management tool. I would say even without this in the picture, React and all of the libraries have some sort of state management, native state management mechanisms. In React, you have use state and context. These are really powerful, and if you can avoid bringing in the state management tools like Redux and MobX, push that off as long as you can. I use both. I like both of them, but for me, I look at them as more of a pattern to follow than necessary libraries for every app. So try to leverage those out of the box tools before you reach for a state management library. And in this case, even though React Query is somewhat of a state management type of library, it's a lot more focused on the idea of updating and invalidating a cache. So it's a little unique. That's all I got before I jump into the demo. Any questions?
Ask in the chat. It'll be a couple seconds before that catches up, but no one's posted anything yet.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the demo. So actually, I will go ahead and pull this up. Let me log out. I'm going to log out of this. All right, so this is a simple to-do list app that I threw together, and this actually started as a project to learn Auth0 end to end. So I use Auth0 at work a lot, and I just wanted to build the whole thing back end, front end, start to finish. So started with the let's see, actually closed the .NET, but there is an excellent guide, official create a web API with ASP.NET Core that walks you through making request in Postman and has auto-generated Swagger docs and everything. So this is a great little tutorial if you want to build a REST API. Highly recommend checking that out. And here is the Swagger spec for the service I'll be using. So it's just a simple to-do list app. And here is the UI. So right now I'm not logged in, and I'll actually show you in the network tab, which I'll be keeping open a lot tonight. As I go in here and add to-dos, you can delete to-dos. Okay, my little local state demo is not working, so maybe work on that. But check to-dos, but notice no requests are being made over here. Like if I change the title or whatever, this is all local state. And so this is just kind of showing these are the same components we'll be using when we do introduce state and start making requests. But here they're working entirely with just use state locally in React. So if I log in, okay.
Hey, George, I'm going to pop in real
So I'll
fast.
actually,
Do you have a question from JC if you got a second to handle it?
sure.
He says, should I reach for React context and hooks before reaching for React query?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. React's hooks and React context are part of React. So if you're learning React and you know JSX and you know props and like those, if you want to use React effectively, definitely want to learn those default hooks and just the general idea of hooks and how libraries expose their APIs via hooks, like React Router. You're going to see use router. You'll want to understand that, and you'll also want to understand context because that'll introduce you to the idea of providers, and that's going to be important in React Query. But definitely, anytime you put into learning hooks or React Query or context are going to benefit you when you want to learn React Query. So I would definitely say start with those. However, if you want to just jump right into React Query, that's also a great way to learn about hooks. So great question. I'm on the landing page. I've logged in. You can see I'm logged in up here. And actually, before I get into all of the React Query stuff, let's just click around and look at some of the Tailwind stuff. So this is actually sort of a clone of another login site. And if you click on this guy, we can go to that class tab down here. And let me pull this up a little bit. So these are all the classes I have on this div right here. And so, if I get rid of the background white, now it's clear. I can get rid of text center and get rid of the shadow. I can get rid of rounded. Maybe I don't like the border, but I want to bring the background back. Okay, I want the shadow. So you can already see just adding these classes, these really intuitive classes that are really just, you can almost think of them as as a function of the actual CSS rule we would use, because if you see text center, the CSS rule it represents is just text align center. There's really not anything else to it than that. There's not really any opinions here. If you say Z10, it means Z index 10. There's no sort of like Tailwind specific opinions being injected here. Now there are some things like rounded where it is going to pick a sort of default, 0.25 rem, but you can also modify that rounded class to change that border radius. So did you have a question?
No, I don't think so. I think everything's been
Okay.
good. I did want to say real fast. I said this in chat. I actually had no clue about that classes tab, and that would have been super handy when I was doing a Tailwind site like a month and a half ago.
Yeah, I actually specifically Googled that and did some reading and poking around because surely other people are having this problem. Like, it just seemed to me that dev tools is not really geared towards editing classes, because almost certainly what you were doing was going in and editing things like this, which can be a huge pain.
Yep,
And then you like click out instead of saying enter. This is clearly not the intended way to do this. So yeah, discovering this class tab was
way better.
mind blowing. So, but another cool thing I'll show with Tailwind, just to show that it doesn't break down when you want to do tricky stuff. Notice when I hover over one of these items, a little trash can appears on the right, sorry. So how do you do that? Because I'm not hovering over the trash can. Well, if we go look at this element, notice that it has a class group. And then if we go look at this trash can icon, and actually this is a font awesome thing. So there's a little SVG stuff in here somewhere though. Here we go. So this group dash hover colon text gray 300, that actually changes the color of that when I hover over the parent group. So you can do group hovering. That's pretty cool. And also another thing I really like about this is because I'm not using Bootstrap, let's say I need a tooltip. Well, if I'm using Bootstrap, I'm just going to use the Bootstrap tooltip naturally. But Tailwind doesn't have tooltips because it doesn't have components, because it's just CSS basically. So I'm free to use whatever tooltip I want. So I can just like Google React tooltip, and of course I'm going to find React tooltip and see, okay, this has a lot of downloads, it's popular, it's well maintained, whatever. It kind of does everything I'd ever needed to do. And I can just pull that in and style it with Tailwind. If you look over, let's see, it's kind of weird getting over there because it's a hover thing, but all those styles are coming from Tailwind. And that's just a simple one thing and one thing well library that does everything I would ever need a tooltip to do. And I'm not stuck with Bootstrap's sort of limited, opinionated version of a tooltip. So that was pretty cool. And that that little circle thing, that's actually React circular progress bar. If anybody wants to use that, it's kind of nice. If I go to a to-do list and uncheck a lot and go back to the main screen, you'll notice that you see the animation as it drops down, and they actually get darker as more increase. And then you can hover over and see how many to-dos have been completed. This is a really fun project because it's a really simple idea. Everybody knows how a to-do list works, but it was kind of a fun way to play with some UI stuff, UX stuff, and make things really clean and intuitive as much as possible. So this is what a to-do list looks like. And one of the cool things I did here, and this will be a great time to show the Tailwind configuration, is notice these little check boxes are the same color as everything else. So it turns out that's not so easy to do. But fortunately, Tailwind has a great community of little plugins and stuff. And this little package makes styling form controls super easy. And even if you are doing this in plain CSS, it can get kind of gritty to override those form controls that are sort of native to the browser. But this makes it super easy. And all you have to do is install Tailwind CSS custom forms, add it to your Tailwind config.js. So you just put it in plugins right there, and then you can style your forms. So if we look at, it's not even any sort of custom syntax. That just allows me to put text teal 500 on that input, and it just works. Now it's got the same color using the classes that Tailwind already provides to give stuff different colors. So I'll jump over to that config real quick. Here's the Tailwind config.js. Here's my purge config, and I've got that marked to true. This is a TypeScript create React app TypeScript project, so I'm only watching TSX files. So it's going to go look in every TSX file in this project, find every class name, and remove everything from Tailwind generated CSS that is not needed. Also, sometimes because the scope of this is so huge, even at 90,000 lines, it can include every possible variation of every style. So sometimes if you want to use certain variations, you need to go add those variants into your config. Like if you want to group hover, that group hover I showed you, there's so many rules associated with that you don't want to have those in there if you're not using them. So if you do want to use something that's not by default, you can come in and add these variants as well. There's where I add that plugin. And then another thing to look at is a Tailwind CSS. This just pulls in base, components, utilities, and custom forms. And I should mention there is a Tailwind UI that does have a bunch of pre-built components. And I think you can even pay for this, but this gives you a bunch of like awesome, nice looking components that are all built with Tailwind. So this is kind of where their pricing model comes in, but Tailwind itself is open source and free and everything. Let me jump back over here. I guess I could just pull open some components here. Yeah, so nav, you're going to see like your JSX will end up having a lot of classes. Let me see if I can find somewhere I'm using class names. Okay. So, oh, I'm not looking at my project. Okay, here we go. And that doesn't even have anything conditional in it. So I guess I must have deleted those at one point. Let me try to find a better one. So in React in general, you know, chances are you're gonna run into conditional class names at some point. Basically, if this thing is true, render some class name, otherwise render another class name. And class names just gives you a really nice syntax for doing that. So in this case, here's this class names function. I'm passing a string of a bunch of class names that are always going to render, but then I can pass an object where the key is the class name I want to render and the value is the conditional. So if confirm delete is true, border none will get rendered. But if confirm delete is false, this won't get rendered. These will always get rendered. So class names is really useful. It definitely cleans up a lot of that class name logic. Here you can see another one. This tends to get gritty if you're not using something like class names. And we've probably all done that. So even when I'm not using Tailwind, I still reach for class names library a lot. It's a good one. So I don't want to spend all my time on Tailwind. So let me jump over to the React query stuff. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions Tailwind or comments or anything?
Doesn't look like it, but I've posted and we'll see if anyone comes up with anything.
Okay, cool. We were going to look at last thing before I move on. Let's just look up Tailwind apply.
Yeah, that question from before. I also have a conversational topic for when you're done with the React query portion of the evening.
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, Tailwind's apply directive. So apply is a Tailwind thing, but that's pretty cool, I think, because I can look at this and see exactly what's going on. And it also, I think it's kind of cool because here we're falling back to those sort of like CSS conventions we're used to. You know, we name a class button blue, it represents the blue button component. But here we're still thinking in class names instead of CSS rules. So instead of like keeping all those like all that CSS syntax in our head, we can kind of just think of it abstractly through these class names. So that's kind of cool. So just want to look that up. But yes, that is a Tailwind thing. Okay. Note that conversational topic. let's jump into React Query. So I'm going to be in the network tab a lot. If you're into web development and all, and you haven't been in the network tab a lot, then this is the one thing you should take away. I stay in the network tab all day, every day. This is where I live. This is, where you can look at your data and make requests and stuff. And Firefox actually has some really cool network tab features like resending a request, editing and resending a request. But what I'll do is I'll just show you some of these simple endpoints. So the get API to do items endpoint, you can actually run these from the Swagger docs. So this is Swagger. This represents the API I'm exposing here. And if I go in and click execute, I've already authorized with Auth0. So I've gotten a token, plugged that in. So I'm authorized here. I can execute a GET request to /API/to-do items, and I'm going to get this response back. So also, the browser is going to see that request and show it in my network tab. And you have to have your network tab open when you make that request. But here's the data I got back. You can see it's the same data down here. But this is my HTTP response. So this was a GET request, localhost 8000 API to do items. It's a 200 status, so it was okay. If I look at the response, I can see all of the data I got back in JSON. So let's see. So I can do the same with a post request. So if I want to try this out, if I create a new to-do list, okay, 201 is when a record has been saved. So here you can see I made a post request to API to-do list, and I got a 201 created. So that tells me that my record was saved. If I look at the request, I can see all the data I sent. That would be this data right here. And here's the response I got. Cool. So that's the network tab. And if we go over to the application and open our network tab over here, here we're going to see some other stuff because when we load, we're going to see our bundle and like React and some auth stuff. And then it's going to get our token for authorization, blah, blah, blah. And then blam, we're going to make that GET request to localhost 3000 /API/to-do list /14. Now I should mention that in my, since this is development and I'm doing this the easy way, I just have a proxy in my package.json to localhost 8000. So that means that every request I make to localhost 3000 /API/to-do list, blah, 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 is actually going to go to localhost 8000. So that's where my API is running. And the reason we do this is to avoid XHR errors in the browser. It doesn't want cross-origin requests being made. So we can just put in a proxy. So when we make requests to localhost 3000 API to-do list, it will actually make that request to localhost 8000. That's what's going on there. And as we saw, there was that initial GET. Now, you can see that since we've looked at this the first time, we've had 3 additional requests. And that's what I mean by the app being chatty. And what's happening there is I'm leaving the screen, I'm going to a different tab, and when I refocus on this tab, it's refetching the data. And honestly, that's what we want to happen. And that's the default behavior in React Query and WSR, the other library I mentioned. The idea is we want to aggressively update the UI based on backend state. So if I leave this tab and I go to another computer and I update something on this to-do list, and then I come back to this screen and it's still showing me the old one that doesn't update, that can be bad. especially if it's, you know, an important, timely application. You want that data to be up to date ASAP. And to do that, you have to go get that data from the server via request. So what's happening here, the reason there's a bunch of requests is because I've been flicking on and off this tab a lot. But typically, you know, if you leave and you come back, you want that data to update. You don't want it to stay stale. So that's why you're seeing a bunch of requests here, and it might seem chatty, but this is actually sort of intended default behavior for React Query. So that's one of the trade-offs to sort of recognize. If I check this box, notice it's going to make a put request to save that. And here I've actually made the decision, you know, when I make this put request, if I look at the response, it didn't give me anything. So if I come back to put to do items, response is just 200. It doesn't return anything. So it's not like I can put that data, and the put verb is usually associated with updating a record. So I'm going to update. Here I'm updating to do item 29, and here's the new data for record 29. I changed is complete from false to true. So it's going to update that, and it's not going to return me back a save record. It's just going to tell me 204, I saved it, you're good, you can trust me. So there are a couple of things we could do here. We could return that save record from this put request, and we could use that record that's returned, load that into the cache, and have our UI update. I don't want to do that. I feel like this is actually, again, this is sort of the default behavior for this example UI, and this put request doesn't return an object in the response. And if I'm working with a third-party API, maybe they don't. So what I could do here is I could take that data that I initially put to the server, the request, and say, it told me it saved this. I'm going to go ahead and update the UI with this data. What I do is when I put that data and update it and get a response that it was updated successfully, I actually re-request this entire to-do list. And that's just a decision you have to make. In my case, I don't really care as much about the individual to-dos because my app treats the to-do list as sort of the primary model. In fact, I've considered just getting rid of a lot of the individual to-do item endpoints. But you can pretty much just request the entire to-do list again. There's not really much advantage at this point to getting granular and updating a singular to-do item. Instead, I updated the to-do item, I got a response and it was successful, and I re-requested the whole list, which updated it in the cache, and then caused my UI to update. So another thing I'll point out is, notice when I check a box, it changes immediately. There's no delay whatsoever. It immediately changes while it's making the request, and that's because I update the UI with local state, just plain old React use state. And then when React query gets the response back, it's going to update the UI either way. So this is kind of optimistic UI updates. And the worst thing that can happen here is you check a box, it shows checked, the request fails, and the box unchecks itself. And maybe in that case, in fact, I think I actually do show like a toast error or something that like it wasn't able to be saved. But I feel pretty okay about this because this is sort of the default Twitter behavior. If you like a tweet and that request fails, or that like fails for whatever reason, you just see the heart kind of pop and disappear. It doesn't really bombard you with like too much information. Reddit will also do this. If you try to upvote something, it will upvote it, but then it will like take your upvote back and say like you were unable to upvote this. The request failed for some reason. And that's fine. These are very like low cost user experience. I don't even want to call them annoyances, maybe failures. But if I click a tweet to like it and it shows the heart, but then the heart pops because something went wrong, I'm not going to be too upset about that. Where you don't want to do this is if you are having a user submit a form and they filled out their form and they put in all their values and they submitted it and it says, yay, you submitted your form successfully. And then a second later, it pops back and says like, psych, your form failed. Uh, error, you got to do something again, or you did something wrong. So when you're optimistically updating your UI, make sure it's not something that's going to irritate your user or be confusing. For something like checking a box, it's really not that big a deal, but you don't want to psych your users out by showing them optimistic UI updates before the server has reported back like, yes, I saved that blog post or whatever. And if you go watch that video by the author of React Query, in his example, he actually shows, you submit a blog post, you see it update optimistically, and then that blog post just disappears if it doesn't save for some reason. You as a developer still have to make that decision. That is not React Query's job. React Query's job is to make it really easy to implement whichever decision you make. So for me to change that and only show the checkbox once it's updated would be really easy. But in this case, if you click that checkbox and you have to wait a second for it to make the request and come back, and then you've already moved your mouse and it updates, that's a little weird. It's a lot less weird to update it immediately and have it pop when it fails than to have to wait. And that's just something I experienced personally from clicking on these 1,000 times. And that's kind of how I ended up at that decision. Let's see if I update this. Okay, same thing, same operation, still a put request when I change the name. I will kind of shout out a couple of things I really like about this UI. It's completely keyboard navigable. It's not perfect, but you can really do anything you need to. Anytime you take any action, it puts your cursor back in the create to-do list. So if you add a to-do, if I'm going to hit Shift Tab to get up here to the title, hit Space Bar, change the title, hit Escape to cancel. That actually didn't refocus, but you can also hit enter to save it. You can do that with these as well. There are a few things I was really happy with, like if you want to edit a to-do, the text does not change shape at all. That was something I was kind of adamant about because I didn't want the text to like switch lines or anything when you get in edit mode. Actually, what happens is the checkbox disappears because you're not going to be checking one off while you're editing it, and you just get the edit controls over here on the right instead of the hidden trash can. If you want to delete, the confirmation is directly in the to-do, so you can like be in the process of deleting multiple to-dos at a time and none of them care and everything is fine. Here you can see the delete request and where I get the to-do and everything. So yeah, that's kind of some of the UI. Let's actually look at the code, which I think is just super cool. How this React Query API kind of looks. So first thing I do is I've got all my requests. So basically everything you see over here, I'm using Axios, which is a HTTP library for JavaScript. And here I've got a function called fetch to-do lists. And all that does is make an Axios GET request to /API/to-do list and pulls data out of that and returns data. And if there's an error, it returns that error. I pretty much have this for each endpoint in the Swagger doc. So you're gonna have fetch to-do lists, plural, fetch to-do list. And this is also all TypeScript. So I'm saying that this will return an array of to-do list objects. This will return a single to-do list object. You can add a to-do item that will return that to-do item. And of course, it's returning a promise that resolves to a to-do item. You can update a to-do item, which accepts a to-do item and does an Axios put request with that to-do item ID and the to-do item data. So this is pretty generic. This could probably be abstracted a little bit, but I kind of like how it's just a simple look at all of the requests that this app makes. It doesn't care at all about how the requests are being made. It doesn't know anything about React Query. These are just a bunch of Axios functions that I'm going to be using in my app. But then I can go over to this hooks file. So these are all my to-do hooks. And here's where I import use mutation, use query, and query cache. And I'm also importing all of those fetch functions from my little API file. And then I just export a bunch of my own little hooks that just return use query and use mutation with the data they need for that hook. So if I want to fetch to-do list, I can just say use fetch to-do list and give it that I'm returning use query with the query ID and the fetch method I need. And this is kind of like a lot like the same as the last file. It's just all of the hooks I'll be using in the app. So there's kind of two layers we've seen so far. There's those raw HTTP requests in one file. Here are the hooks that pass those requests to use query and use mutation and return those as the hooks we'll be using in our application. And this is also where we make the decisions about what we want to do when we make each request in terms of what we want to do with our cache. And so a cool one, let's see. Okay, so this is kind of cool. So if I add a to-do item to a to-do list, I'm going to pass in that to-do list. Let's see. So I'm going to call the add to-do item, or I'm going to give it the add to-do item function, and then on success, I'm going to take the response and I'm actually going to manually set the query data. This means that I don't have to refetch the entire thing. Let's actually see what that looks like. So inspect. So network, add. Okay, what happened there? Notice it didn't make an additional request to get the to-do list. It just made this post request and it got the response back. And we took that response and updated the to-do list data. Actually, I should mention this entire thing here is the query key. So the query key can actually be an array, and the query ID that represents this particular to-do list we're looking at is an array with the string to-do list and that to-do list ID. So that's how we identify it. So we're saying set the query data for the to-do list with this ID to this data that we got from the response. And that updates the UI without making an additional unnecessary request. So hopefully that demonstrates that, while it may seem chatty, that's by design, and you're ultimately the decision maker of how you handle each response. Now, I couldn't do that same thing with that put request unless I went and changed the API to return a saved object in the response. I would need to take the input and set that, and that's a little risky. So it's just recognizing the trade-offs and recognizing what you can do with this library and sort of the API it exposes, but it covers pretty much everything you could want to do. So to look at, let's see where this is a to-do list item. So use state is complete. Here we go. So this is kind of what I'm talking about, where I optimistically update the user interface. This is the to-do list item component. So this is this entire component right here, and it's got a lot of state. You know, it can be checked or unchecked. There's the name of the to-do. And let's see, when we toggle is complete, we're going to set is complete to the opposite of what it is now. So that's where we're calling set is complete on local state. So that's going to update the local state right away. Then we're going to call update to do item, which if we look at where that's coming from, that's actually getting passed in a prop. So we don't see the use update to do item hook here. That's actually in the parent, but you can see that we're calling update to do item with the new to do item object, and we're passing in the alternate value. So this sort of aggressively updates the state. It's then going to call update to do item in the parent, which I believe would be update to do list. So let's see, to do list item. Okay, so yeah, so it will call update to do list item, and that's actually, this is kind of passed in. This is to handle local state, so I could probably use context for this. But right now I'm kind of prop drilling down update to do list item. In edit to do list, update to do list, or update to do item is actually being pulled out of the use update to do item hook. So I just pull out use update to do item mutation. Actually change some of the naming on this, so I could actually drop that now and just call this update to do item. Keeps things a little bit cleaner, but that's pretty much the full circle. So I'm pulling in use update to do item from that hooks. In that hooks file, I'm passing in my update to do item fetch method to that React query hook use mutation. Then I pull that in here. I pull update to do item out of it because this is array destructuring. You can name that whatever you want. It's the same way that use state works. Actually, that was kind of a cool thing I learned out of all this, is the difference between object destructuring and array destructuring. And that's one kind of cool thing about array destructuring, is you can name it whatever you want. So you could call this update to do item mutation or update to do item, it doesn't matter. I'm passing that in, and then eventually I'm going to call that with the to-do item that I want to update. And React Query is going to handle the how we handle the cache with the data we get back. There's really not much more to it as far as React Query goes. There's not really much configuration or anything that I can think of. You really just import these simple hooks, and you can, let's see, you can just kind of wrap them up in your own hooks if you want. You can use them directly in your code, which is what I did at first. And then I realized like a lot of it looked the same, and it'd be easier to just put these in one place and import them. But that's about it. So questions,
Nice.
discussion.
Yeah, I posted asking for questions about a minute ago. Nothing yet, but if anyone does have a question, be sure to post over in chat. George, I'm going to go ahead and bring us over and stop your screen share for now. The
Okay.
question slash conversation topic that came up when you were still talking about Tailwind was with the existence of CSS frameworks. Obviously, we were talking about Tailwind at the time, but you know, going as far back as Bootstrap and all that. Is there less of an emphasis on needing to know how to write good CSS from scratch? And this is from Literial, maybe, in chat. So I'd be curious to hear your take on it, and then obviously, you know, sometimes where my head goes with it.
I think yes and no. I think that people will always need to be able to build things to specification, and a lot of times that requires CSS. Um, if you're working for a serious organization that needs their stuff to look good, sometimes specs are going to come down. We need something to look a certain way. You got to make it look that way. And to do that, you got to use CSS. That's just how we express a lot of things on the web. Just as important, though, and definitely not to be discounted. And I think this is where sometimes this becomes maybe an unnecessary debate. It's just as important for the entire world of software development to be able to produce modern, nice looking, responsive UIs without being UI experts. And what things like Bootstrap and Tailwind provide to the world, it, it's the ability for people to create awesome UIs without being experts. And maybe they have something really cool to give to the world, and they build a UI, a Bootstrap UI around it, and it benefits thousands of people, and it looks great. It looks like a Bootstrap site. It looks great. So I think there's always going to be both. I personally, I just in the past year or so really fell into CSS Grid, and I think that's amazing. And CSS is not going anywhere by any means. It's evolving and getting better and better every day. So it's definitely important to keep an eye on CSS and know it and learn it and appreciate it and keep up with what's new in it. Uh, but I think Tailwind is one step closer than Bootstrap to giving people the ability to build really nice looking UIs without that expertise, but also not locking them into the Bootstrap way of doing things and the Bootstrap look and feel. So
And I would also,
I think why not
why not
both?
both? Yeah, yeah. I think that there's definitely a also like a side of it. Like if you look at the class names in Tailwind, it's not that they're doing something different than CSS. They're just applying CSS. So you still kind of have to know what's
Yeah,
going to happen kind of under the hood at that point too. So like I think that as we kind of go forward, no
right.
matter what, you need to understand what's happening, even if you're not writing CSS, and even if you're not having to worry about cascade issues and specificity and all that, you still need to like know at least how to use those properties that you're kind of digging into.
Absolutely. Like you can't really be as effective with Tailwind as someone who knows CSS if you're not going to learn that stuff. And I also think that uh, Tailwind is another pathway into learning that stuff in CSS because you can manage like z-index and stuff in Tailwind just like you can in CSS. And the fact is, if you run into that situation where something is in front of something, z-index is how you fix that, and that's
Yep.
CSS. And z-index is what you're going to be using in Tailwind. So you do have to know that stuff for sure. Perhaps even more so than Bootstrap. Definitely more so than
Yeah, I
Bootstrap.
definitely say
So
that. Well, it doesn't look like there are any other questions. I'm gonna go ahead and kind of give that one more second there. But George, I appreciate you coming on and kind of talking about React Query, Tailwind, and kind of giving a presentation. And if we don't hear from anyone in chat in the next, I don't know, 30 seconds, I'll go ahead and say we're good, and I'll do a quick outro, and we'll go to sleep, at least for those of us who are an hour ahead of Memphis nowadays. I miss Central Time.
Well, one thing I would like to know, just in terms of polling the crowd, is what people think of that idea of what we've been calling local state management for 5 years. Like, what do you think about the idea that what we're really talking about is synchronizing our UI with the server? It's just HTTP caching. So much of what state management is just caching HTTP requests. Certainly, there are things like which tab is open and maybe positions of something on the screen that are specific to the UI that are, again, ephemeral. They can disappear and we don't care, but they're truly associated with the state of the UI. But then, like, the vast majority of what we call state management is really just a cache of our HTTP requests.
A cache, and not just
So
a cache, because I mean that's I think that feels right. But also, you mentioned a while ago now about kind of that idea that you can, I can't even remember that. Oh
I can still hear you. I think you lost video,
no,
but
I blew a fuse or something.
oh,
Uh,
your power is out. I can still see you too. You're in
all
the
right,
dark.
hold on. Yeah, not even my overheads are on, so that's fun. I gotta figure that out. Yeah, but the idea that we are hopefully updating state when the server may or may not match it. Wow, I
Yeah,
lost a lot. I lost an entire power strip of stuff down here and my overhead lights. But like that's not caching per
bummer.
se. That's kind of like updating before the request even happened.
Right. Yeah. So, but that kind of is local state. So, like the thing with the checkbox, we do have this local state. It's there. We can control it. We can manage it. But, when I made the decision to check the box before I got a response, that was sort of optimistic uh, UI state management. But really, the source of truth is the server, and I'm going to try to aggressively update from the server as much as I possibly can.
Yeah,
Nice, like the flashlight.
I can't actually monitor myself right now, but I can see myself on the stream at least. Yeah, there's some spooky React query there. I'm gonna go ahead and say that we're probably done for the night at this point before like I blow any other circuits. Let me see. JC Smiley said, I looked at state management as a global state shared between pages, components. Adding data from outside the source is an extra level of concern.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is all that data that's being shared between those pages and components, that's data that came from your service that you're keeping track of in a store somewhere. And let's acknowledge that store that we're keeping that data in is uh, by any means the conventional way of thinking about this. And maybe it's just taken a minute for UI to kind of catch the reality of what we're doing, which is caching our data from the source of it. And if we recognize that, we can follow proven patterns, how to make that reliable and consistent. And it doesn't really change the fact that all your components are going to be sharing that data. They're just going to be acknowledging that it's a cache and treating it as such. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing, but I think that React Query versus like WSR will be a hot topic for a while moving forward, and there will probably be some other ones that follow this, and maybe even MobX and Redux will weigh in on the whole thing. So we'll see.
Nice. Well, George, I appreciate you you hanging out with us tonight. And as always, the floor is open for you. So if you ever have another presentation, feel free to let me know. I'm gonna switch
Cool.
over to. Is there anything you want to plug before I switch over to just my view real fast?
No, we just need Dev Memphis talks. So if you got something you want
devmemphis.org,
to talk
right?
about, yep.
Nice. And yeah, you can also hit me up and I'll get you over to George too. And speaking of that, and I'm switching over theoretically if all works according to plan to uh, my one-off screen. If you have anything you want to present to web workers, which is front-end focused, obviously as of tonight you saw George talking about React and JavaScript and CSS. Let me know. And next month is open. I need some more people coming in. Hopefully, I won't blow a circuit next month. But I just put all these lights on this power strip today, so that was probably my mistake. So yeah, let me know. And for now, we'll go ahead and raid over to another channel. Let me see who's on the live coders right now. How about we go take a look at Docker with who are you? You are Mastermind. So let me get his info up, and we will raid over there. And hopefully, I'll go to the end screen. Y'all can keep chatting for a minute while I get us going.